Welcome back, everybody. In this video, I'm going to be explaining some examples of how to use the JavaScript ternary operator. Now, when you really look at it, the ternary operator is really just a very terse version of a if statement. But it looks kind of weird, it looks intimidating, it looks like code. And of course, as JavaScript developers, we're probably used to things being very readable. They look like English. We're used to if, else, and some very obvious implications of what these keywords do. A question mark and a colon is not necessarily very clear to us. I'll include a link to the MDN page because it has plenty of examples that you can look over in the description of this video. They cover some examples that I don't think are really great versions of, or examples of what you could use this for. I know that if I came across them in somebody's code, they'd probably be a bit more confusing than if they had honestly just written out a typical if statement. So I'll show you some examples of how you might use it or how you might see it used and give my own personal opinions on when you should use it. First off, it'll be used a lot of times, at least in the past, for setting default values in a function. So if you're passing into something like this incredibly useful function, which takes a value and an array, and it maps over the array that you pass in, turns every value in that array into the value that you passed in. So obviously, this is not production line code, but it'll show you what I mean. So first of all, let me just clear my console so we don't have a bunch of junk. And we're going to pass in the nums array, and we're going to pass in the value whoop. And what we'll get back is an array that's completely replaced every single number with whoop. So we'll do node run, and we get whoop, 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 whoop. Okay, and that works just fine, unless, of course, you have a situation in your program where, for whatever reason, maybe this is user input, and user input is always evil, that there could be no nums array, in which case, or array at all, in which case R would become an undefined value. So if I just completely remove that, and then we run our code, it's going to say you cannot map over something that's undefined. And that's because we don't actually have an array to map over. Now, of course, you could write something like this. You could say, all right, well, you know, if there is no array, then we will assign array to equal an empty array, else, because I try to pair them with an else statement, else array equals array. Right? This is very redundant, of course, but I'm trying to get in the personal habit of pairing if and else statements. I just think it's a good concept for me to follow. And so now, of course, we do have a value for array, which is an empty array. So we should just get back an empty array. Let me see. Empty array. Good stuff. Of course, this is very, very clunky code for what we need to do. All we really need, because the ternary operator offers us a much simpler version. We'll see afterwards in comparison that that's very clunky. But all we really are asking is, if there's no array, what do you really want to replace it with? It needs a default value. And so we can say R equals, and then the way the ternary works is first you give it a condition, so something that will be evaluated to a Boolean, true or false. And so we'll just say R equals R, and it will coerce that to something that's either true or false. And in the case of undefined, that is false. So it'll be converted to a false value. And the next part of the ternary expression is the actual ternary operator itself. And so at first this seems weird until you realize, okay, well, it's really just asking a question. R? Like, do you have one? Is it a thing? And if it's undefined, if this is false, so is this true is really what it's asking. If it's true, then just use R, right? So if R exists, then use it. Otherwise, which is what this part of the statement means, otherwise use an empty array. And so now we have a function that can handle it if nobody passes in, if somebody doesn't pass in any value for R. Awesome. And hopefully that explains how ternaries are structured syntactically. Of course, this is something you'll probably see in a lot of code. If you see this at the top of a function, they're assigning a default value. So if there is no value, this is the default. But now with ECMAScript 2015, or ES6, as everybody would prefer to still call it, despite what people will tell you to say, you can do this for a default value. So I can just remove that guy from node run, and it still works. So that's why I said you'll see this probably in older code or even in new code if people have the habit and they're not really in the habit of doing this yet. This is the new way to set default values, but that's the older way. So you'll probably come across that a lot, and you can just think to yourself, oh, I know what this is. So that's how they work, and one example. The next example is all kind of pseudocode, but it'll show a basic situation, which is setting multiple values with if statements. So instead of writing, in this situation, we just have this hypothetical is good value, which will be evaluated to true or false once you run this function that finds out if it's good, whatever good is, right? And then you have this parameter 1 that needs a value if it is good and this particular value array has a length, which what I'm really trying to say here is there any content in this array, right? So I'm imagining a situation here. Sorry, I should have provided a bit more context before I dove into the code. What I'm imagining here is that you have an array that can either have nothing in it, so it's either an empty array, or it has two values, an A and let's just say AB, okay? So those are your two potential options. You either have an empty array or you have an A and a B. And so if it has a length, which means this is going to be evaluated to something that's true or false. So if its length is 0, that'll be false, so it'll return false, which will be assigned to param1. Otherwise, it'll have a length of 2, which will be true, or truthy, and so it can use then parameter, or the first element in the array, which actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I would need to have 3. So this would be C, because I used 1 and 2. I did not 0 index those. So you could then use the second element in the array to be param1, and the third element in the array to be param2. Now, you could write this out with if statements, but this would quickly become if is good and r.length. Then you would have your block scoping for the first chunk of the if statement, and then you would do the same thing with this second parameter, and you would end up with something like 5 or 6, about 6 probably different lines of ifs and else statements, just to say that you want to use this first value. Because of course what we really want is just to be able to say that param is equal to array1, the second value in the array. But if that value doesn't exist, this will throw an error. It'll throw an exception. So you don't want that, so you have to have some logic to handle it. And this just seems to me like the easiest way to handle that sort of logic. So this isn't a fully fleshed out example, but it's a structure for how you might, a situation you might see where it might make sense to use a ternary, where basically you have a couple parameters that can be evaluated to true or false, and it'll give you a situation where you either want to use that value or you don't. All right, so hopefully that makes some semblance of sense. I know I prefer examples, and that would have helped me, so hopefully it makes some sense. Now we're going to hop down to the bottom here. You'll see this one at the bottom is all commented out, and that is because it was throwing all kinds of errors because we have some broken code here. So what we've got down here is an array of objects. Let me just make sure my computer's not going to die. No, we're good. We have an array of objects. Each object has a bool, which is either true or false, and a name. And so what this function is going to do is it's going to do this thing where it checks to see if the previous value was true and the current Boolean is false, then it will convert the current Booleans to a string of we. There's no practical reason why you could probably want to do this, but it'll show you why you might need a ternary, because I did something that uses this principle that was totally different. It had to do with days of the week and time zones, but I did not want to bother writing that out. So instead, I wrote it this stupid example. Now, the problem that we'll run into if I run this code is that it'll look for a, well, first previous is not defined, right, because I haven't written that. So let's just, if I just said let previous equal true, so that will automatically pass, then what will happen, oh, it's going to reg anyway. What I'm trying to hit here is that there's a problem where it will check in this first element in the array for a previous value. All right, and then you'll try to get the Boolean property off of that previous value. But of course, there is no previous value, so it can't get a Boolean property. So it'll throw an exception, actually stop your program, because it's trying to get a property off of something that's undefined. Now, what you could do is, like I mentioned in a previous example, you could do something like if, let's see, if array I, which is the current index that we're on in the array. So in this case, it would be 0, right? So if I subtract 1 exists, which means that we are not on the first element in the array, because every other element has a previous value, the first one does not. So if there's a value before the one we're currently on, then let previous equal, and we'll have it equal the array and that previous values property of Boolean, else array, else let previous equal array, actually just be false. We'll just go with false. So the problem here, first of all, is that let is block scoped. So we can't actually run this because let will still be undefined, or previous will still be undefined. So if I run this, previous is not defined, right? Because this creates block scoping inside of our if block. Well, then we could, of course, just change this back to being var. And if we make this var, because var is not block scoped, it will then work just fine. But the ECMAScript 2015 police will come out at you and be very upset that you did such a thing as use var. So instead, you'll have to do this, where you declare previous as a variable, but you don't initialize it with any value. And that way, you can do the value initialization inside your if block, and that will work. But that's just stupid. Why? Like, we now have 3 lines just to do something that we're about to do with one ternary. And so, if we remove that, we remove that, and we remove that, what we're really asking is we will let previous be the value if, oops, not index, if array has a, if there's a previous value in the array, then we will use that previous value that has a property of bool, not ball. Otherwise, we'll use false. And so now, if we look at our array, the only time that there is a value that has a previous, or an object that has a previous element that is true while it's false is the second one. So this one's going to say, is the previous value true? Yes. Am I false? Yes, I am. I will become we. This one has a previous value, but it's false. So it's not going to be converted to we. So now if we look at this, that should be what we get. That's what we've been getting all our other examples. So we produced the same code 3 different ways. But hopefully, if you buy into my opinion on ternaries anyway, this is the most obvious most easily readable and understandable way to do it. Initializing a variable with a value based on a certain condition that is really just simply written in one line. So I hope that this quick overview of ternaries made some sense. Hopefully you'll start using them if you're not already. Throw any questions in the comments below. Like the video if you learned something, because it honestly does help. And again, I'll include this code or the link to this code in the description so that you can check out the MDN's examples. Again, they get a little crazy. So personal opinion, if you want to use them, go for it. I just think my examples are about the only times when I would use it for myself. Thanks. I'll see you in the next video, guys. Bye.